want to welcome everybody to this panel on the attacks on the administrative state and the future of public administration. How many of you remember the pointy-headed bureaucrats? There you go, some hands go up. So the attack on the administrative state began at least as far back as George Wallace when he ran for president, and his attacks on the pointy-headed bureaucrats. And so that's what we're about today, all those pointy-headed bureaucrats and the terrible, dastardly things they're doing to the country and why they need to be brought under control. Or at least that's what a lot of the language about the administrative state has been lately. And of course, for the current administration and many of its supporters, that's captured in the idea of the deep state that is out to undermine the country and undermine the presidency. Now, I gather that most of us, having been teaching public administration and public policy for a while, probably are not so jaundiced in our ideas about public administrators and what they do. But it's clear that there are a variety of challenges facing the administrative state. And so what we want to do this afternoon is to begin to explore those, to get us all thinking about it, and hopefully to begin thinking about what the implications of these challenges are for what we do in our public policy and public administration programs. What are we teaching? How are we teaching it? What message are we conveying? And how do we address those challenges to ensure that we have a just, equitable, effective government? And I think for most of us, having a just, equitable, effective government means having an effective, just, equitable public administration. So the administrative state is under challenge through recent Supreme Court decisions and other court decisions which are undermining the authority of the administrators and of the administrative agencies, and potential under the current Congress suggesting substantial limitations on the ability of Congress to delegate to federal agencies. We have the sidelining and silencing of scientific experts in and out of government, and a diminished attention to the use of evidence and knowledge in decision-making in the public sector. We have moves to weaken agency capacity, and of course this goes back a considerable amount of time, and we've had the hollow state and terms like that we've used to talk about it, and the substitution of judicial judgment for administrative judgment. So again, less deference to administrators as they go about fulfilling their responsibilities under the law and under the Constitution. So the panel is going to talk about the broader context of these challenges to the administrative state, the specific legal and constitutional issues facing the administrative state, the potential effects on social equity, and the implications for public policy and administration and public affairs programs and what we do in our curriculum and in our classrooms. So we got a great panel, really insightful panel. We have Sarah McClellan from California State University, Sacramento. She's going to kick things off for us a minute and give us a broad perspective on this. We have Stephanie Newbold from Rutgers, co-editor of the American Review of Public Administration. Bill Resch from Southern Cal, he's on his home turf, and Blue Wooldridge. Blue is now retired. This happened this past year, but I want to share with you that he is now the Distinguished Career Professor and Professor Emeritus. So they created a new title for Blue when he retired.
No pay, but a great title. I did get new cards.
So Sarah, will you please take the floor and get things going for us?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me in the back, or should I use a microphone? Can everybody hear me? Okay. So you'll notice that the title I chose was Threats to the Administrative State rather than Attacks on the Administrative State. And that is in part because I am trying to cover the breadth and provide as much context as I can possibly pack into, I think, 12 minutes or less. So some of what I see in terms of the mechanisms that people have studied that impact the administrative state are not just external attacks and overt attacks, but challenges in administrative state functions in keeping up with social and technological acceleration and meeting the needs of today effectively. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about a variety of forces that potentially undermine or erode administrative state function. So I find it helpful, and I still use in teaching with my students. I talk about the strategic value triangle that Moore introduced and others introduced at Harvard years ago. And I like to think about the three parts of this strategic triangle as being incredibly important in the overall health of the administrative state. So that means that we're understanding the legitimacy and support, or what they term the authorizing environment. So to what extent are political leaders, credible sources, actively supporting or undermining administrative state functions? What is the value proposition, and what are the arguments or debates about what value the administrative state does and should bring? And what kind of operational capacity do we have? And is that operational capacity in sync with the kinds of values and the support that we have for this? And so you'll see there are a lot of questions. In 2008, Camilla Stivers raised a number of questions going back to Dwight Waldo and arguments about the administrative state around this notion of value. And so she asked questions about, to what extent are we grappling in the world of public affairs, are we grappling with the different forms of value and tough questions? When does efficiency drive out quality? How are we paying attention to equity and the role of equity? And I know Blue will be really spending some time with that. And so there's a critical normative function of the administrative state. And then what happens around the technical capacity? It's arguably much easier to talk about and measure the technical capacity or value of the administrative state than it is about equity. It's much harder to get to clear performance measures, but that doesn't make it any less important. So how are we having those tough conversations about the different types of value the administrative state brings? And to what extent, I would ask, are we doing that in our programs when we work with students? So I was also particularly interested in what are the different mechanisms at work. If we look across disciplines, because we are by no means the only set of disciplines really grappling with administrative state issues. There are sociologists, there are communication scholars who are studying this, there are educational scholars trying to understand this around civic education. And so we see a lot of research in this area that I think we have an opportunity to bring together and draw on to answer the questions that matter most to our disciplines. And so the different mechanisms that I found across much of the literature fall in these areas: the ideological, the political, bureaucratic, legal, and educational. And so I'm going to do a sort of speed run through these, and others will drill down in more detail on this panel. So the first is what I think many of us are most familiar with now on a daily basis. So it's about the rhetoric and the ideology around the administrative state. And so we see direct attacks. I'll pull up in a couple of examples in terms of the news, in terms of political leaders, how people are talking about and often blurring lines between governance, government, and the administrative state. We see, again, some of these debates rising to the surface around efficiency versus quality. And a lot of scholars, especially in the field of communication and the fields of communication and sociology, have studied how corporate language and corporate values may arguably be driving out some of the other values that matter to the administrative state. We see declining trust in expertise and institutions. And RAND just put together, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to look at it, a report called Truth Decay that came out last year, where they looked in depth at questions around attacks on expertise and what are the different ways that these attacks take place, and how does it look different than it did in decades past where we saw some similar dynamics. There's also this decentering of purpose. If we're struggling with these questions, practitioners in the workforce are, many of them, struggling mightily, I would argue, to try to figure out how to position and talk about the value of what they do on a daily basis. I think that's a huge responsibility and opportunity that we all have to support them in that effort. So here are some examples of the tensions and the rhetoric out there. This is part of what I'm studying. I have been on the White House mailing list, so this title to the bottom left is the kind of rhetoric that's going out on a weekly, sometimes daily basis to those on the White House mailing list. So you can see they talk about Trump taming bureaucracy that's running roughshod over Americans. We also see a lot of conflation again between what is government, what is politics, what is administration in the kinds of headlines and language used in these communications. You see a lot of articles about the size and the cost of workforce, but in many cases they're not particularly nuanced in terms of what we know is that much of that workforce is now private and nonprofit. We've got contracting, we have DeUlio and Light and others doing a lot of really important research in this area, and I'm not sure it's making it into the public eye. I've been asking at trainings, asking graduate students what they know about the size and shape and the makeup of federal government, state government, and what I'm finding is not a lot of knowledge about this. So I think we have some real opportunities to not just do the research, but figure out how to get it out there in impactful ways. We see political mechanisms, and there's some great research, of course, in political science on this. Electoral disincentives for politicians to really work on oversight issues and strengthening the administrative state. If it's not helpful in their reelection, if it's not helpful to their constituency, there may just not be the incentives. You see active efforts to bypass by doing executive orders at the presidential level, and you see presidential disassociation from agency accountability, and that's not just the current administration, that's been going on for some time. We also see that oversight is often construed as a negative or as a necessary evil rather than an opportunity to strengthen institutions. And we see reduced committee and staffing experience that clearly has an impact on the quality and efficacy, the expertise that we rely on. And Kettle recently wrote about overpromising and underdelivering. And so when political leaders overpromise and underdeliver, that has a direct impact in terms of public trust in the administrative state. We see bureaucratic mechanisms, talked about hollowing out. We have barriers to hiring and retaining talent. Vircule and others, and I suspect you may talk about this as well. We've got a number of features around direct agency dismantling, reorganization. Some of these pressures come from within and arguably from without at the same time. At the same time, you have sociologists who have been studying the impact of social acceleration and massive technological innovation and how that requires regulation and administrative state functions that our current institutions may simply not be built for. For example, Rosa writes about how the very institutions that we needed to generate the massive technological opportunity that has provided so much benefit, now these institutions are actually decelerators or brakes rather than accelerators, and how are we making sense of those tensions? And we also have questions about oversight and procurement in this context. There are legal mechanisms that I know other members of this panel are in a much better position to talk about with knowledge, but we certainly see potential court decisions that have impact on administrative state, the deference on what's inherently government work that will impact contracting. So a lot of important decisions that may be made and impact the administrative state. And finally, educational mechanisms. And in many ways, I think that we have our biggest areas of opportunity and some of our limitations here as scholars and researchers working with practitioners or future practitioners. So we see declines in civic engagement. That was a big topic at NASPAA last spring. And so what role do we play in addressing civic engagement? Neglect of legal and historical foundations, and I think others up here will be talking about this in some detail, but to what extent do our programs pay attention to political philosophy and not just the technical or organizational management of the administrative state? Vircule and others have also talked about reduced endowments and reduced funding to support those who go into public sector work. And in many cases, those big endowments and those financial support programs go to private sector at a much higher level, and we see much less public sector pipeline investment. And then what about private contractors? So Light and others have talked about how many of our those delivering services in the public sector are actually have never taken public sector management classes, don't have any of the background in public sector governance and what it means in terms of the underlying philosophy and values. And so what is our role? I was excited to hear people in panels talking about that this morning around the possible innovation blueprint. What is the role that we might play in supporting skills development, just-in-time delivery for new skills, but also in the context of public sector service? And so there are all of these messy relationships going on when we think about the different aspects of what's required to address a healthy administrative state. And so are we studying and really working to understand these relationships? Because even though this is an oversimplified capture here, we can argue that we have a bit of a vicious cycle. We have agency limitations and accelerating demands. And then we've got real bureaucratic administrative challenges around vacancies and over-reliance on contractors. We have loss of expertise. We have radical turnover in staff. And we have role clarity questions, reduced government accountability. That all feeds reduced reputation and trust. And it creates a fertile environment for those who wish to attack the administrative state. And of course, some of the consequences we see things like regulatory capture, oversight failures, infrastructure neglect and collapse. So finally, I would say just call to action a few possibilities, and others will probably talk about this in more detail as well, but I think we have a chance to expand scholarly and practitioner efforts to look at what does it mean to define or redefine the administrative state for a new era with the social and technological acceleration we're seeing. How can we teach about the role and purpose, especially to broader audiences? How can we study the social and technological acceleration, strengthen our understanding of public perspectives on the administrative state? And I would also say call out the amazing work that's being done, because the administrative state is not just this monolithic concept. We talked about the sort of Darth Vader sound of the administrative state, but it's about people, and it's people doing amazing things all the time. And how can we call that out more effectively in the work that we do and with our partners who are doing that work on a daily basis?
Thank you. I want to thank Ed for putting this panel together. I think this topic is one of the most central areas affecting not just public administration and public service, but American government in general. And I don't think it's an unfair statement to say that our government is in a crisis right now. And how this field and how the public chooses to address that crisis, I think will really determine how successful the United States can be in the future. And political problems become constitutional problems when our citizenry and those who are covering politics and media fail to understand how our constitutional republic is structured. And that is a central issue in determining sort of how we move forward in some of the really pressing issues in American governance today. I believe that the central foundation of U.S. public administration is found in its democratic constitutional heritage and its rule of law, in the affirming and dissenting opinions of the Supreme Court of the United States. In Federalist 27, Alexander Hamilton, writing as Publius, argued that the people's confidence in and obedience to a government will commonly be proportioned to the goodness or badness of its administration. One of the cardinal elements of the founding period is that good government cannot exist without good administration, and good administration cannot exist without good government. And so this idea that we can separate the idea of what is going on politically with actually how we run administrative services and public services and everything that the citizenry depends upon with our government is really an opinion and a viewpoint that has very little understanding both in theory and in practice. I will say this. So if you all look at the November issue of ARPA, Charles Goodsell, who was one of my former professors at Virginia Tech, has a wonderful article on the wrath that the Trump administration has brought on both public administration and public sector governance. And it's a really fantastic piece that looks at sort of the practical reality of how public service and how public administration, particularly at the federal level, has been considerably diminished under the tenure of this current administration. And with that said, I am just going to make this point, and everything sort of that I want to talk about today is sort of grounded in this. I think it's fair to say, and this is not about politics, but this is about understanding where and how the Constitution grounds the legitimacy of American government and its administrative institutions, that the Trump administration makes a mockery every single day of the democratic constitutional norms and values embedded within American government. It cares very little for the rule of law and how the rule of law dictates where the boundaries of our political and administrative institutions reside. And I think we are at a crisis point in public administration with regard to the damage that the Trump administration is bringing onto our profession, both from a practitioner standpoint as well in many ways from an intellectual standpoint. Just in the last 24 hours, okay, you will note that the Trump administration has declared that the G7 summit next year will be held in Miami at Trump's hotel, which is a direct violation of the Emoluments Clause, stating that no person, whether the President of the United States, a member of the House, a member of the Senate, a member of the federal courts, can benefit financially from their time in office. And this will have a huge financial asset, or build a huge financial asset for the presidency. The reason that in the United States, the G7s or the G8s, however many countries are involved, are always held at Camp David is because airports have to be shut down for leaders of countries to come in. All right. So the reason it's at Camp David is because all of these leaders of countries can fly into Andrews Air Force Base and then can be taken through various security details into Camp David. Having this event at Miami means that at this particular time, Miami International Airport has to be shut down. Okay, no one can travel out of or into Miami International Airport. Not only that, but major roads, major intersections, major tourist areas have to be shut down for security purposes. So the idea just on the local level of how this will impact the city of Miami administratively is going to be just a striking example of administrative dysfunction. And, I heard Marco Rubio say, well, this will bring great commerce to the city of Miami. Actually, I think it'll undermine commerce because nobody can get there to spend any money during this time. So I think that's something that's really important. The chief of staff to President Trump, Nick Malvoni, noted yesterday that there was a quid pro quo in the Ukrainian call, saying that in order for the United States to honor its military obligations and promises to Ukraine in terms of giving them military support to defend itself against Russia, that Ukraine had to find dirt on Hunter Biden so that could benefit President Trump and his next presidential run, which he thinks will be against Biden. That too is a violation of the rule of law. It is illegal to seek foreign help to fight and to campaign for political elections in this country. You've got the Kurdish crisis right now, okay? The United States pulling out its military relief efforts in Syria, and the Kurds were so central to us in fighting ISIS, and now we have essentially led them to slaughter. And this is, I think, very interesting. This is the first time that the Republicans are really getting on board with significant criticism of the Trump administration. But if you watch and you listen to certain former military generals who were talking about how this fundamentally erodes the standing of the United States as a global power, and how this undermines our allies and our ability to create partnerships and coalitions on an international level. That too has a serious effect on the administration of governance, both domestically and internationally. One of the largest departments in government is the Department of Defense, and if we undermine their credibility, as well as the militaries, to carry out foreign and international priorities, that can have a huge effect on how the United States is seen in a global level.
But where were they on D-Day?
Yeah. And then you've got the going back to the Ukraine scandal. I don't think there's any doubt that there is going to be an impeachment. I think it's a matter of when that will come out. The difference between this sort of administrative impeachment inquiry versus the Clinton impeachment, or even going forward before Nixon resigned from office, is that in the Nixon case, there was a grand jury that investigated what was going on in the Watergate situation. In the Clinton impeachment, you had the Kenneth Starr report, okay, that sort of outlined everything that Clinton would later be impeached for. Here, there has been no special counsel. There has been no investigatory examination outside of the Congress. And so what Adam Schiff is doing right now is really putting together the case. One of the reasons that these hearings that are going on right now are not public is because there has been no investigation prior to this. And so the Congress has to build that investigation before it can make a decision about whether or not there is enough evidence for impeachment to go forward. But I think it's very clear that impeachment is going to happen. And that too will have a great effect if the leader of the executive branch is impeached, and whether or not he'll be removed from office. In terms of public personnel, we have seen the freezing of new hires in the Trump administration. We've seen the disablement of federal government civil service. There have been delayed administrative appointments, about 1,200 Senate confirmation appointments in the Trump administration are needed. 600 of these that are critical to operations that have not been approved yet. And so if you don't have the proper people in place to do the job of government cannot be done. In February 2019, only 54% of Trump's civilian executive branch nominees had been confirmed. So you're seeing huge areas in the federal government that are not being serviced, and that means that core functions of executive branch management are not being conducted. I will just say, in terms of the war on administrative state, there was a really important Supreme Court case last term, Gundy versus United States, in which the really big opinion was the dissent by Neil Gorsuch, who has basically come down on the line of Steve Bannon and the Bush and the Trump administration, that the administrative state is evil and that it needs to be disabled and disarmed. And he basically makes the point that Chevron deference should no longer be applicable, that administrative agencies should not be able to interpret statutory law to determine if the application of that law is reasonable and permissible, that he wants federal courts and federal court judges to be the ones that interpret statutory law and not administrative agencies. And so that creates a much greater perspective as to whether or not, as to how much power and role and expertise administrative agencies will play in sort of the shaping of administrative governance. I say this is a dissenting opinion, but this case was decided before Kavanaugh was appointed onto the Supreme Court, and Justice Alito said he would actually be really interested in voting this particular way. He voted with a majority on a concurrence, just simply because he didn't feel that this case was the right case to sort of look at this issue, but that he was very open to it. And so this is going to be something that public administration has to pay really close attention to. If the Supreme Court makes the case that administrative agencies can no longer interpret statutory law through the rulemaking process, that will essentially mean that administrative agencies have no role and no function in determining how laws are implemented across American government at the federal level. And so that will play a really important role in sort of thinking about how administrative agencies and how Congress moves forward, both in terms of writing law and agencies in terms of thinking about the implementation. I'll close with this. I think even if Gorsuch's opinion becomes the majority, I don't think it means that much, and I'll tell you why. Because administrative law constitutes very little of the Supreme Court's dockets. I mean, in some years there may be 3 cases, and other years there may be no cases on administrative law. If the court says that if the Supreme Court says that federal courts have to be the determining factor in interpreting statutory law for administrative agencies, that means that that is all the courts will do. Okay, they will not be able to deal with anything else on their dockets. Okay, and they still, if they work 7 days a week, 80 hours, if they work 7 days a week and 80 hours a week, they would not have enough time to deal with all of these issues that come before administrative agencies. So I think in theory, this idea sounds really great. We want the courts to substitute their judgment for administrative agencies if you believe that the administrative state is fundamentally out of line. I think in reality, that will never happen. There's no way that the federal courts are so overwhelmed as is right now at the district and the appellate levels that to inundate them with this amount of work will absolutely, it's not a practical area. And so I think it would be I don't think that would have an opinion. Just going back in U.S. v. Meade in 2001, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1. Scalia was the only dissent. That essentially that's what should happen. Administrative agencies should look to the courts and not to themselves as to determine whether or not they should have the authority to interpret statutory law. And essentially that case overturned Chevron deference. And the reason Chevron deference is still in place is because there is no way courts can do that. Okay, so in many ways we have seen that already come before the Supreme Court and the court rule in that area, and there's no way to implement it, and so we're still back to Chevron deference. And so I think this is a really important time. I'll close with just one more thing. I'll close with this. In Federalist 51, James Madison says that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must always be connected to the constitutional rights of the place. The danger right now is that the President of the United States does not consider his role to be connected to the constitutional rights of the Republic. And that's why public administration is in trouble.
My comments are, I'm going to rely on a few genericisms, maybe even stereotypes, so please forgive those. There are exceptions, especially at this table, for instance, that could tear down some of these, but I'll speak kind of broadly about public management or public administration. I'll also speak broadly about political science with an eye particularly on bureaucratic politics, the focus on bureaucratic politics. And also, I don't know if Al Roberts is here, but I am going to avoid using the term the administrative state with a nod to a really good paper that he has out currently. I'm really talking about the state of our civil service. And so, like all good stereotypes, it's good to start with a joke. So a public administration scholar and a political scientist walk into a bar. Public administration scholar, he lifts his beer, toasts the political scientist, and he says, never met a bureaucrat I haven't liked. And the political scientist says, cheers, I've never met a bureaucrat. That may seem like an indictment on political science, but I would argue that it's just as much an indictment on public administration, in the sense that much of our scholarship tends to take kind of a technocratic view, ignoring the political environment in which these bureaucrats are embedded. Now, meanwhile, to finish that joke, the bartender is a first year law student and realizes through the conversation that he is the preeminent legal expert in the bar amongst these two gentlemen or women. So my argument here is we need to do better in advancing the integration of disciplines that contribute to our understanding of the professional civil service. And as I assess the state of both public administration, again, generically, and political science, again, with an eye towards bureaucratic politics, with respect to the subject of how to shape and bring integrity to the institution of our civil service as a macro scale institution, I am left with an overwhelming takeaway that there is a significant lack of sustained attention in both fields to administrative law. And this inattention has led both fields towards pathologies of managerial and political silos that ignore rule of law as a pillar of the administrative state and of the U.S. constitutional structure generally. Alternatively, I am also struck by the relative lack of public administration or bureaucratic politics scholarship as it has unfolded over the years in the field's primary journals and conferences that is used in constructing popular arguments on the legitimacy of our permanent career civil service. Indeed, I would argue that public administration as an academic enterprise has largely become silent or perhaps not heard in conversations about critical issues of government legitimacy and crisis. Public administration and management scholars have become too close to their subjects, ideologically or sympathetically prone to be supportive of the professionals they study, tend to focus on micro-level phenomenon as a result of this within the work environment of public administration in action without properly acknowledging its implications to macro-level perspectives, and generally ignore or hold constant political environments in which those subjects are embedded. Political scientists who study the bureaucracy's relationship with political institutions, on the other hand, often emphasize the political environment and sacrifice an understanding of organizational behavior with implicitly negative assumptions about civil service motives underpinning their theories of delegation, an underappreciation at best of professionalism within the civil service, and an apathy generally to the implications of public administration in action to a robust democratic state. Our field is severely limited without a better understanding of the primary institutional element of law. And though constitutional and administrative law scholars would certainly succeed in listening more to public management and political science, the disciplinary divide among these three approaches to understanding the civil service has a complicated etymology, but one in the US at least that's also tied to the separation of institutions that they principally study. Simply put, constitutional administrative law is not being taught in PA or PS graduate programs. Of the accredited NASPAA programs, for instance, fewer and fewer actually teach law. It's perfectly possible that most students who get a PA degree do not take a single law-oriented course. Meanwhile, people who do not have law degrees lack confidence to integrate legalist perspectives into their scholarship, and moreover, constitutional and administrative law itself is actually not something that is emphasized even in legal education. But even more troubling to many in this audience who I see as logical positivists, which I see as the presumptive philosophical approach of much public management and political science scholarship, is that they're not always empirically derived answers in law. Administrative law inquiries lead to many it depends responses, many explorations of normative consequences. And because answers are often so ambiguous, this ambiguity can instill some level of misapprehension on our part. Another common obstruction to embracing constitutional administrative law is that PA and PS research is that it's an extremely challenging enterprise, one openly tackled in other works, but perhaps not emphasized in public administration or political science. The relative role of the courts in administrative decision-making has basically, in our frequentists approach, been dummied out or assumed in sometimes rather egregious ways. Now, democracy and bureaucracy, of course, are seen as almost diametric opposites, but neither can function without the spine of public law. In the US, we've tried over time to consciously and subconsciously retrofit the bureaucracy into the US constitutional regime. And if one subscribes to Madison's precept that the aggregation of all three powers of government is the very definition of tyranny, then it doesn't look good from our political or cultural perspectives to have one agency writing, enforcing, and adjudicating its own rules. Yet, I would argue that it's a serious mistake to recognize the bureaucracy as simply or solely subordinate to an executive. Some agencies may be more subordinate to the president, for instance, than others, but even those closest cannot claim the executive branch as its sole authority. Heads of even EOP require Senate confirmation. The courts, meanwhile, seldom enter into these examinations by our scholarship. Mainstream PA takes an almost entirely executive-centered perspective, but Congress and the courts seem to be lost dimensions that may in fact be dominant in influence and legal standing. But on the same side, for political science, there's a hegemony of congressional dominance that's prevailed for the last 2 decades in the study of the bureaucracy. It's a framework that's steeped in the Madisonian normative political theory that posits agencies should be under abundant control of the legislature. Rather than focus on how the professional norms and responsibilities of expert bureaucrats might define their behavior and hence protect against quote-unquote adverse selection, the congressional dominance perspective emphasizes the approach that promotes moral hazard as our primary concern in American democratic governance. The answer to the question, why does this bureaucrat act this way, is often because the incentives imposed by Congress, or to the lesser extent the president, rather than internal checks of professional or organizational values. So one common theme among the congressional dominance literature, however, that I see is a glaring lack of empirical evidence of actual bureaucratic behavior. Rather, the outcomes in their models emphasize actions Congress employs to anticipate and presumably program bureaucratic behavior, but the relative success Congress has in doing so is largely missing. For instance, one approach has been to count the length of a law as a proxy for the extent of constraint for agency policymaking. And this, from a public management perspective, borrowing from Hal Rainey at least, is a very naive understanding of how bureaucrats might interpret legislation. I mean, longer statutes could actually provide more ambiguity and more autonomy to these bureaucrats. But again, the role of the courts is just largely glaringly absent, with notable but few exceptions. Finally, by examining the administrative state from the perspective of public law, we might be better positioned to understand the fundamental differences between public and private power and the implications of privatization from more than a managerial, economic, or political perspective. In other words, there are implications that privatization brings not just to the political economy, but to the very notions of democratic sovereignty and constitutional legitimacy. The rules of the game in political economy, for instance, become critical to understanding incentives that career civil servants, political executives, and legislators have, and the extent to which these incentives drive both strategy and outcomes. Through the lens of administrative and constitutional law, one can also understand how these rules of the games have changed over time, and the independence of secular trends reflected in legal doctrine that incorporate history, context, and contingency, as well as the development of zeitgeists or ideas over time that inspire public and legal opinions in terms of the legitimacy of our civil service. But public administration is lacking in the current domain to contribute to big picture understandings of our professionalized civil service writ large, especially insights that incorporate studies of political institutions and administrative law. In my opinion, the field is thinking small, missing the forest for the trees, and practically, in many ways, incapable collectively as scholars of providing big picture diagnoses of the administrative state as an institution integral to maintaining liberal democracy. Pardon me, Al, for using that word. The collective of public administration scholars have described how the patient functions with the ailment instead of diagnosing the causes and symptoms of what I call democratic disarticulation. That is the separation or cause of separation of key accountability mechanisms in the policymaking and implementation functions of government. The realization of perpetual gridlock in our constitutional separation of powers underscores the need for a robust understanding of our civil service. The public administration scholarly community could be blessed with more scholars that can speak with an authority on the macro phenomenon institution of our professionalized civil service as a whole and its role to liberal democracy. And that's a voice that provides legitimacy to that role and translates well to cognate and contributing fields and disciplines to public administration. And to borrow basically from Hugh Heclo, I argue that we need to think institutionally about the state of the professional civil service and its relative adherence to public law. This is a critically important view to take in our current polity, but one in many ways that has been forsaken, largely abandoned in self-identifying public administration scholarship and in bureaucratic politics. But there are fabulous exceptions, so I'm going to back out of my stereotypes and to note some of the great work that's being done by folks like Andy Whitford and Gary Miller's, their phenomenal work on the Federal Reserve, Amy Zagert's work on intelligence agencies, Bob Durant's seminal exposition of environmental regulatory frameworks that are grafted onto our national defense apparatuses, American political development scholars like Hacker and Pearson, Dan Carpenter, Steven Skoranek, David Lewis, and Jennifer Celine's contributions to the source book for the Administrative Conference of the U.S., Ann O'Connell's retrospective work on the Appointee Vacancy Act, Rachel Potter or Carnal Rasso's most recent insights on the regulatory procedure and its implications to the presidency, and on and on. Put simply, in conclusion, the public administration scholarly community lacks much authority in assessing the state of civil service on a macro scale, despite its prominent role in policymaking. And we may have even less authority as a scholarly community in making cogent arguments on its relative legitimacy. We have to strive for synthetically integrating various perspectives of organizational management, political economy, and public law. And therefore, our work and our community of researchers has to make a better effort to speak to the traditions of political science, speak to the traditions of administrative and constitutional law, as well as organizational behavior, where I've seen us drifting quite a bit. So this is certainly in part due to the incentives that we've structured within our respective disciplines and academia. And so as a function of this, no one may turn to us if we continue down that road. And I'm asking for us to return to the idea that public administration is not inherently a managerial function. It is a constitutional function, one that has managerial, political, and legal elements, and probably most important, the legal foundations that are found in our Constitution and the Administrative Procedure Act, for instance. So, thank you very much.
And let me mention one thing. Stephanie gave me credit for organizing this, but this really began when Bob Denhart read an account of that commentary by Gorsuch in a Supreme Court case this past summer and organized a group of people to meet in Sacramento at the USC Center to talk about that and to talk about ways in which the public administration community might begin to think about that. So I agreed to put together a panel for the conference here. There will be a session at the NASPAA conference in Washington, D.C. in November. And then there's going to be a presidential panel, as I understand it, at the NASPAA conference in the spring. And Bob's been reaching out to scholars across the community. I think many of you in this room have been contacted by him to begin thinking about this. And so we really begin this as the beginning of a dialogue about issues related to this Supreme Court case and things that may flow from it.
I'm Blue Wooldridge, and I will say that the administrative state is under attack because we haven't done enough about resolving the issue of growing inequalities in this country. And not only that, part of it has been the problem of what I perceive to be us progressives, because as we've tried to reduce environmental pollution and overgrowth and so on, we've left out the concerns and the issues of significant members of our population. We're not going to train or retrain a displaced miner in West Virginia who's 55 years of age and make him a computer programmer. I accept it, and we're doing the right things about reducing the carbon footprint and so on, but we've forgotten significant members of our community, and we're not responding to them. I'm Blue Wooldridge, and I listed only some of the organization affiliations I am because my interests are shaped or framed by some of the activities that I've been involved in. I used to chair the standing panel on social equity for the National Academy for about 9 years. I co-chair the equity committee here at NASPAA. I'm a former president of the Black Education Association of VCU, a former president of COMPA. I grew up as a poor black kid in a section of Lexington, Virginia called Mudtown because we didn't have good streets or good drainage, and so all of that has kind of shaped my concerns as I become an old professor, and now a lot of my work is in the whole area of social equity and diversity issues. I believe that one of the concerns that we've got is that not enough of our public administrators are knowledgeable about or get taught in our classes issues about social equity or inequities. And one of the things that the Equity Committee of NASPAA is trying to do is to bring about ways in which we can integrate equity concerns into our classes. We used to talk about the three E's, economy, efficiency, and then finally in the 90s or the 80s, we started talking about effectiveness. I think that there's at least 5 E's, and one of them is ethical, of course, but the most important of these, going back to Corinthians, my old Sunday school days, the greatest of these is equity. And we need to make sure that all members of our society are by the way, it's very appropriate me being in California, because I heard this a quote from the current governor, Newsom, when he spoke at the Social Equity Conference up at the University of San Francisco about 2 years ago. And being a good Jesuit, he knew this literature. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to that in public administration. The problems I've got is that, yes, I consider inequities as being a cancer in society, but we're making progress on cancer. As we shall see in something I just added to my PowerPoint this morning, we're going backwards in terms of equities. I'll just skip over a couple of things. I mean, most of us know this data, but I don't know if all of our students do. We talked about increasing inequalities and what the Great Recession or the Great Depression, Great Recession I did on the impact of minority communities. We know that the compensation, I loved Abigail Disney when she said Jesus Christ himself wasn't worth 500 times more than his average worker. And now we know, of course, there's some CEOs that are making 1,000 times more. And again, that trend is increasing. The inequality in the United States has grown since the 1970s. The Gini coefficient was only 41.5 in 2016, up from 34.6 in 79, but we're still, the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the United States is growing even more. In September, the Census Bureau pointed out that the Gini index grew to 0.485 in last year. The more positive, as you know, the Nobel Prize in Economic Science was given out on Monday, and the two prize winners, two groups of prize winners, won the Nobel Prize for their work on reducing global inequity. So some people are dealing with this. I make some, and in the United States, in terms of developing world, the inequalities is much higher than many other countries. The Scandinavian countries are much better in dealing with social inequities than we are. Why should this be of interest to the public administration community? I love this quote from Darwin: "If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." And I will argue that the attacks on the administrative state are not caused by, but are reinforced by the fact that the inequities are caused by our government organizations. The National League of Cities issued a report in 2003, Divided We Fall, led by a council member from West Virginia, who pointed out, I think very correctly, that government itself is the cause of most inequities in our country. I've got several more of these, but I'll just close up. If we really want to do something about building support for government, The people have to see that we care about them, even the very least of them, and that we are working of making their life better. Now, in public administration, we had this big debate. Should this be the role of the elected official, or should this be the role of the bureaucrat? Those of us who talk about teaching public administrators about social equity get criticized because that's not our role. We should have a rule of law. I don't even think that's terribly important. I want to close out with this quote that came from Todd Laporte. I don't know Todd Laporte. I know some people in here do, but apparently he was part of the new public administration, and he wrote this right after the new public administration. And I'm really intrigued by this, and I hope that our public administration students recognize that the purpose of public organizations should be the reduction of economic, social, and psychic suffering and the enhancement of life opportunities for those both within the organization and outside of the organization. And that's what we ought to be teaching in our schools of public administration. Thanks, Ed.
Blue, I want to thank you for being so concise and leaving some time for the audience. Blue is an eloquent speaker who has a lot to say, and you really got to the point today. So we do have a few minutes left, and we'd love to get reaction or commentary from people in the audience or questions from anybody in the audience.
So I would just say, I think one of the things that PA needs to do a better job of is talking with practitioners and engaging practitioners in a way that connects our theory to what they are doing and then connects what they are doing to our theory and finding those bridges. I mean, I think one of the great parts of PA history, particularly the high noon of American public administration, orthodoxy, and Franklin Roosevelt's administration, is that some of his key advisors on major domestic issues were some of the most senior scholars of our profession. And so there was this bridge between how government was changing and the role of public administration in that change as a study, as a school of thought. And we've gotten away from that. And so I think one of the things that would be really helpful is to start having more conversations on the practitioner side.
Anybody else?
We've made great progress in performance measurement, but haven't done as much in terms of measuring inequities. And I'm glad that the Academy is doing some work and doing research on what are different measures so that we can assess the degrees of inequities in our community, and therefore we can respond to them.
And I gather, Bill, that you would say we need to do a much better job of educating ourselves about law in the administrative
Both
state.
law and politics.
Yeah, law and politics. Yeah. Okay, Sarah? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to suggest that the nexus between, I think, Stephanie's comment and what Blue talked about in terms of with some of that work with practitioners with equity at the base, what does that look like from the grassroots level all the way up?
I want to thank the panelists for all the insights they shared with us, and thank the audience for being with us.